My phone rang at 4:07 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at it twice. Once when the ringing pulled me out of sleep, and once when I understood, in the 2 seconds between seeing her name and answering, that a call from Bex at 4 a.m. was not an accident and not an emergency of the usual kind. Bex does not call at 4 a.m. for emergencies. She calls at 4 a.m. for the things she has not been able to say in daylight. I answered. I said her name. She was crying, not the sharp kind, the slow, steady kind that has been building for a long time and has finally found a way out. She said, "I'm sorry. I know what time it is." I said, "I know what time it is too. Talk to me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been practicing this speech for 2 years, and now I'm on the phone at 4 in the morning and I can't remember a single word of it." I said, "Then don't use the speech." She said, "The speech is the whole plan." I said, "Plans change. Talk to me." Another long quiet. The kind that has texture to it, weight, the specific quality of someone finding the door to a room they have not been able to enter for a very long time. Outside my window, the city was doing what it does at 4 a.m., which is breathe differently, slower, darker, like it has finally put something down. She said, "Theo?" I said, "I'm here." She said, "I love you. I have loved you for 2 years, and I practiced a speech about it for 2 years because I could not figure out how to say it in any form that wouldn't." She stopped. "That wouldn't make everything complicated? But it's 4 in the morning and I've been lying here and I can't keep it tidy anymore." I did not say anything. She said, "Say something." I said, "I'm trying to figure out why you thought it would make things complicated." She said, "Because you're my best friend." I said, "Yes." She said, "And if I say it and you don't, if it doesn't go the way I need it to, then I lose the best thing I have." I said, "Bex." She said, I know that's the calculation. I've been doing the calculation for 2 years. It's a terrible calculation, and I've been doing it anyway." I said, "What made tonight the night?" She was quiet again. Then she said, "We had dinner 3 hours ago. You walked me to the tube and you said, see you Thursday, same as always. And I stood on the platform and the train came and I thought, I cannot get on one more train. I cannot do one more Thursday. I cannot keep having the thing I have and knowing it's adjacent to the thing I want and pretending that's enough." That sentence. The train, the Thursday, the adjacent thing. I sat in the dark of my flat and held the phone and thought about all the Thursdays, which were a standing dinner that had existed since month 3 of knowing her, which I had never once wanted to cancel, which was information I had apparently been keeping in a poorly labeled drawer. My name is Theo Adebisi. I'm 32. I work in documentary film, researching, developing, occasionally directing, which means I spend my professional life trying to find the true story inside the available story, the thing that is actually happening underneath what appears to be happening, the real subject that a surface subject is pointing toward. I am, professionally, attentive to subtext. I notice it in interviews, in archive footage, in the gap between what someone says and how they say it. I mention this because the gap between what Bex said every Thursday and what she was apparently saying every Thursday is so obvious in retrospect that it constitutes a professional failure I will not quickly forgive myself for. Bex Calloway, 31. She teaches secondary school art, which she does with the precise quality of someone who understands that making things is a form of thinking, and that thinking is best learned by being witnessed while someone else does it. She draws constantly. Her bag has always had a sketchbook in it, always the same kind, small and black. the kind that fits in a coat pocket. She sketches people when she talks to them, not looking at the paper. The kind of drawing that is really a form of listening. She had sketched me, I knew, many times. I had never asked to see them. I understood now that I should have asked. We had been best friends for 3 years, 4 months and some days. She had called me when her father was in hospital. I had called her when the film I had spent 18 months on was dropped by its distributor. We had stood in rooms together during the bad things and the good things and the ordinary things, which are the most important things. The things that build the structure of a friendship so gradually you stop noticing you are inside it and begin to mistake it for the air. I had been inside it for 3 years and had not looked at the shape of it clearly, which is the documentary filmmaker's particular failing transferred from the professional to the personal, and which I would also not quickly forgive. I said, "Bex." She said, "If you're about to say you need time to think," I said. "I'm not." "Silence," I said. "I'm trying to figure out how to say something that I have not been paying attention to and should have been, and I want to say it correctly." She said quietly, "Theo, it's 4 in the morning." I said, "I know." She said, "You don't have to," I said. "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. Give me a second." I gave myself the second. I thought about the Thursdays, which I had never wanted to cancel. I thought about the call when the film was dropped, which she had answered on the first ring at 11 at night and stayed on for 2 hours and had not once told me it was getting late. I thought about the sketchbook and the drawings I had never asked to see. I thought about the train she had not been able to get on tonight, which was 3 hours ago, which meant she had been lying in the dark for 3 hours before she called, which meant she had been trying to stay quiet about it even when she had already decided not to stay quiet about it, which was the most Bex thing I had ever heard. I said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." I said, "The sketchbook." She said, "What about it?" I said, "How many times have you drawn me?" A pause, long enough that I could hear her breathing change slightly. She said, "That's a strange question for 4 in the morning." I said, "How many?" She said, "I don't count them." I said, "More than anyone else?" The pause this time was different, smaller, more deliberate, the pause of someone deciding something. She said, "Yes." I said, "Since when?" She said, "Month 2. I said, "Month 2. She said, "You were explaining something about a film you were working on? The way you talk about work, you get very specific, very precise. You use your hands." I started drawing and I didn't stop. She was quiet. "I have a lot of drawings of your hands." I looked at my hands in the dark of the flat. I thought about how often they had been across a table from her without me understanding that they were being looked at. Really looked at. The way you look at something you find worth looking at. I said, "Bex." She said, "Don't say it if you don't mean it." I said, "When have I said things I don't mean?" She said, "Never. Which is why I need you not to say it unless," I said, "Bex, I'm going to say something true." She was quiet. I said, "I have never once not wanted it to be Thursday. Not once in 3 years, not when I was tired, not when I had deadlines, not when I had other things. Every week when Thursday came, I was exactly where I wanted to be." I paused. "I have been walking you to the tube for 3 years and watching you go down the stairs and walking home and thinking about what we'd talked about. Still, all the way home, every time." She said nothing. I said, "I did not know what I was doing with that. I put it somewhere and left it. I think I must have been afraid of the same calculation you were doing." She said, very quietly, "You were doing the calculation." I said, I was keeping it at one remove, which is different, but similar enough. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite crying, something in between. The sound of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been told they don't have to hold it alone anymore. She said, "I had a whole speech." I said, "I know." She said, "Structured. 3 parts. I thought if I made it structured enough, it would be less terrifying." I said, "Did it work?" She said, "I forgot every word of it the second you answered the phone." I said, "I'm glad." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because the speech was for the version of this where you had to be very careful. And you don't. You don't have to be careful with me." Silence. The long, specific kind that is full rather than empty. She said, "I've been careful with you for 2 years." I said, "I know, you can stop." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Theo, it's nearly 4:30. I said, "I know." She said, "I live 40 minutes away." I said, "I know." She said, "I could." She stopped. "I could come over." I said, "I'll put the kettle on." She said, "It's the middle of the night." I said, "Bex." She said, "Yes." I said, "Come over." She came. 43 minutes from her door to mine, which I know because I watch the time the way you watch the time when something that matters is in transit. She arrived in a coat over her pajamas with a sketchbook in her coat pocket, which she had not planned to bring and could not have said why she had. And I opened the door, and she looked at me the way people look at something they have been trying not to look at directly for a very long time. And I looked back, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. She said, "I really did have a speech." I said, "I know. I'm sorry you lost it." She said, "No, you're not." I said, "No, I'm not." She came inside. I made tea. We sat on my kitchen floor, not on the chairs. On the floor, backs against the cabinets, the way you sit when something is too large for furniture. And she showed me the sketchbook without being asked. Pages of it. 3 years of drawings that were, as she had said, very often my hands and the way I sit when I am interested in something, and a version of my face I would not have recognized as mine, except that it was drawn by someone who had been looking at it for 2 years with a great deal of care. I held the sketchbook for a long time. She watched me hold it. I said, "These are the truest things anyone has ever made of me." She said, "I know what you look like when you're paying attention." She said it simply, without performance. I've had a lot of time to learn it. I closed the sketchbook and set it on the floor between us, and I looked at her in the specific way she had drawn me when I was paying attention, which was because I was, and I said, "Can I ask you something else?" She said yes. I said, "The speech. The 3-part structured speech you practiced for 2 years. What was part 1? She looked at me. Something in her face shifted. The careful management of 2 years lifting very slightly, like weather changing. She said, "Part 1 was the part where I told you that you were my favorite thing about my life." I said nothing. She said, Is that too much?" I said, "No." She said, "Part 2 was going to be the reasons, specific ones. I had a list." I said, "I'd like to hear the list." She said, "It's long." I said, "We're on a kitchen floor at 5 in the morning. We have time." She told me the list. It took a while. I listened to all of it, which is the only thing you can do when someone has been keeping a list for 2 years and has finally decided to say it out loud. Some of the things on the list I recognized in myself and some I didn't, which is how it is when someone has been looking at you more carefully than you have been looking at yourself. I said, "Part 3. She said, "Part 3 was going to be the ask." I said, What were you going to ask? She looked at the sketchbook on the floor between us. She said, I was going to ask if you thought there was any version of this where we could find out. I said, yes. She said, I haven't asked yet. I said, I know. I'm answering anyway. She smiled, slow, real, the kind that starts somewhere she can't manage and arrives on her face without her permission. She said, you're not supposed to answer before the question. I said, I make documentaries. I know when a question's already been asked. You've been asking it for 3 years. She said, and you're only answering now. I said, I'm a slow subject. I needed the right interview conditions. She looked at me. I looked at her. Outside the kitchen window, the city was beginning the very first pale edges of a morning. The way mornings begin before they announce themselves. Quietly, with the specific patience of things that have been coming for a long time. She picked up the sketchbook. She opened it to a blank page. She said, can I draw you? I said, you have 100 drawings of me. She said, not this one. She looked at me with the look that was going to be in the drawing, the paying attention one, the one I had just learned she knew better than I did. I've never drawn you like this before. She drew. I watched her watch me, the sketchbook not looked at, the pen moving on the page without her eyes, the way she has always drawn, which is listening. It took about 10 minutes. Then she turned it around. I don't have the words for it. I have looked at it many times since, and I still don't have the words. It is the truest thing anyone has ever made of me, in a different way from the others. Not what I look like when I'm paying attention, but what I look like when I know I am being seen, which is a different expression and one I had not known my face could make. I said, can I keep it? She said, it's always been yours. 6 months later, her sister asked her how she had finally said it after 2 years. Beck said, I called him at 4 in the morning and forgot the speech. Her sister said, did you panic? Beck said, yes. But Theo told me to talk to him instead of use the speech, and that turned out to be the same thing. Her sister said, what did he say that made it okay? Bex was quiet for a moment. She said, he said I didn't have to be careful with him, and I believed him, because he'd never once given me a reason not to. The sketchbook lives on my shelf now. The one with the drawing from that morning is a new one. She started it the night she came over, she told me later, with the intention of filling it only with things that were ours. I have watched her fill it, page by page, over the months since. She still doesn't look at the paper when she draws. She looks at whatever she is drawing, which is very often me, and the pen finds the shape without her directing it. She showed me the speech, eventually. Typed, 3 pages, 2 years of revision tracked in the margins. It was good, structured and careful and true. But what she said on the kitchen floor at 5 in the morning, without a single word of it, was better. The unplanned version of a thing you've been making for a long time is almost always better. The form knows itself. You just have to let it speak. What would you have done if your best friend called you at 4 a.m. and said they'd practiced a speech for 2 years, but couldn't remember a word of it? And have you ever kept something, a drawing, a list, a version of someone, more carefully than you knew how to say? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.